So research shows that if you have ADHD, then you're more likely to struggle with obesity, you're more likely to struggle with binge eating. And the reason why is because people with ADHD have different or altered reward processing. So they can eat food, but they have much more increased cravings to that food. And then when they eat that food, they have much less satisfaction. So you're at a bit of a disadvantage here, which can lead to binge eating, skipping meals, wanting more of that food, and eating more food, making you gain weight, become obese or overweight, having more fat stores. And the tricky thing is, on top of having increased cravings for food, reduced satisfaction, when you have higher levels of fat cells or adipocytes, we used to think that they're only storage cells and they don't really do anything. But the thing is, having adipocytes or fat cells, they're highly active metabolically. When you have more fat cells, you have lower levels of BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So BDNF, which means nerves, and then trophy, growth, you have lower levels, then you're gonna have higher levels of ADHD symptoms. And if you're a higher body weight and if you're struggling with binge eating as a child, then it's something to look into, because you might have lower levels of BDNF, which can contribute to increasing your risk of ADHD later in life, or you might probably have ADHD already, you never know. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the 5 reasons which is essential to understand why you have more cravings, why do you want more food, why you really struggle with your weight when you have ADHD, which can lead to binge eating and having a higher body weight. And then after understanding all of these principles, we're gonna talk about how we can combat all of these so you can maintain your weight or help you lose weight and have reduced cravings. How can you battle all of this? So number 1 reason why people with ADHD struggle with binge eating and their body weight is because, like I said earlier, they have altered reward processing. So let's say a neurotypical person who doesn't have ADHD sees a cookie, has a craving level of 5, eats a cookie, and has a satisfaction level of 5. But now let's go back to someone who has ADHD. So let's say they see a cookie, they have a craving level of 10, and then they eat a cookie, and then they had a satisfaction level of 3. So someone with ADHD is going to want to have more cookies to get that same level of satisfaction compared to someone who's neurotypical. So maybe you might have 2 cookies, or double the amount of cookies, or 3 times cookies until you feel that satisfaction. It's like this analogy of a skeleton trying to eat food in cartoons, like in graveyards when they try to eat a burger. It just goes straight through them. They don't really enjoy it. It probably just falls down to the floor every time they're eating. And it's just the same thing. It's the same mechanism. So number 2 is people with ADHD have altered inhibitory control. So what this basically means is they can't really control themselves. Their impulse for food is much more difficult to hold themselves back from a cookie compared to someone who's neurotypical. Because someone who's neurotypical, if they say, okay, I'm gonna hold myself back from eating cookies throughout the day, yeah, that's easy. Sometimes it could be quite simple to do. But someone with ADHD, they say, okay, I'm gonna cut myself, no more cookies. Then 5 minutes later, I'm just eating tons of cookies. Have you ever experienced that if you have ADHD? It's the moment you think of something, then the action is gonna proceed it instantly. There's no gap. So thought and action for a neurotypical person, the distance is quite wide. They have lots of time to think about it, have this mental battle in their minds. But someone with ADHD, you think about it, and then action is right here. You're gonna instantly think about it. So impulse control is reduced in people with ADHD. So number 3 is people with ADHD have altered emotional regulation. So when we eat food, we get dopamine, we get that happy feeling, that psychological high if we eat chocolate. But let's see the 3 effects that dopamine does to our body. So number 1 is you get that pleasure from that food. You get that little high, that happiness from the food. That's what we all know dopamine for. Number 2 is you start to crave the food more. So if you eat 1 cookie, then you won't want to have more of the cookies because your cravings are much higher compared to someone who's neurotypical. Number 3 is it reinforces the behavior. That's what dopamine does. So if I eat a cookie after feeling stressed, then the next time I feel stressed, I'm gonna have more cookies. And remember, stressed or feeling difficult emotions is quite common in people with ADHD. So it's easy to turn to food whenever you experience a difficult emotion because you're reinforcing that behavior again and again and again. So what really happens here, which is really interesting, is you feel difficult emotions, then you have food, difficult emotions, food. But the more this cycle happens again and again and again, the more you're reinforcing that behavior, the more it's getting easier to just fall into that. And sometimes you don't even notice it. Sometimes you might feel like it's just a natural thing. You just think it's natural because it's normal. It's so reinforced that you don't even notice any craving. So number 4 is emotional dysregulation. So people with ADHD experience emotions more intensely. So let's say you're angry because someone's walking in front of you and they're so slow and they're blocking the way. Someone who's neurotypical would experience an anger level of 5, but someone who has ADHD would experience an anger level of 8. So when you experience difficult emotions, it's easy to turn to food. So people with ADHD, when they experience that emotion, it lingers on much longer. So someone who's neurotypical who had that anger level of 5, they might think about it for 30 seconds and then just forget about it for the rest of the day. But someone who has ADHD, they'll think about that really angry experience probably for several hours or even the whole day. At sometimes it can even they can struggle with it for a few days. You might think about it. They might constantly think, I had that bad experience. And when you experience more intense emotions, you're more likely to head to food. You have also much less coping mechanisms. If you struggle with finding coping mechanisms for ADHD, then I have a link in the description for my coping mechanisms ebook, which you can download for free. Anyway, so now moving on to number 5. So they have lower levels of interoceptive awareness. So interoceptive awareness is your ability to recognize your hunger cues. You recognize a grumbling stomach? Okay, I'm feeling hungry. So people with ADHD have reduced levels of that. They can't really recognize a grumbling stomach. They're so focused on one task or they're so focused on another task that they can't really focus too much on what their body's feeling. Sometimes they might not even feel if they're cold sometimes because they're so focused on one task. And that can lead to skipping meals, making you feel hungry, and then binge eating, hence leading to a higher body weight. So all of these 5 things contribute to you wanting to eat more food and gain weight, struggle with binge eating. So remember when I said food reward is decreased when people have ADHD? So there are 2 ways to counteract this. So number 1 is to savor your food, because nowadays we live in a hyper-fixated environment where we're constantly eating food mindlessly. So nowadays we can actually go to a movie theater and they'd give us a gigantic bucket of popcorn with tons of butter, and even before the movie starts, you're so mindlessly eating that you just finish all the popcorn, and probably you just might head over to get some chocolates, crisps. You might even just eat mindlessly nowadays, eating our meals or chocolates in front of Netflix, in front of Disney Plus or whatever, when we're binge watching certain shows, because nowadays, or maybe you might be even eating and you might be listening to a podcast or watching YouTube and learning, because nowadays we need to be so productive, because eating without doing anything, that's unproductive. Well, actually it is more productive than anything because you're actually eating mindfully. So eating mindfully, when you're actually savoring that food, you're actually trying to grab as much reward from the food as much as possible. So people with ADHD, once they start to eat mindfully, no distractions, not even music distracting you, then you might actually get a higher food reward than someone who's distracted and they're neurotypically eating that food. So number 2, which I kind of talked about earlier, is try not to distract yourself when you're eating food. So try to avoid watching TV. Try to just simply keep the TV off if your chair is in front of a TV. Just not even on your phone. No music, no phone, just simply eat the food. Simply just savoring the food. You're grabbing as much dopamine as possible, grabbing as much reward as possible, and you're also being able to recognize your hunger cues. Remember how we talked about the interoceptive awareness? You're not able to sense your hunger, a grumbling stomach. The same thing, you're not easily able to sense a full stomach if you're eating mindlessly. We can eat a whole bucket of popcorn and not feel hungry at all because you're constantly watching movies, for example, or watching TV shows or being distracted on our phones. So that's the best way on how we can increase the food reward as much as possible. So the next tip I will recommend for people with ADHD is that don't keep any unhealthy food in your house as much as possible. So normal advice for people who are neurotypical, they can keep food away and hold themselves back, even if there's tons of chocolate in front of them sometimes. But ADHD, you have this short window of, you think about it, instantly you're going to have it. So keep your food as far away as possible, or just don't buy any unhealthy food like chocolates, cookies, cakes that's already pre-made and in packets. If you do want to have any unhealthy food, or what people would call junk food, then you'll have to make it yourself. Try to keep the gap as far as possible. If you want cookies, don't buy cookies. You have to make them. Learn how to make them. Flour, sugar, butter, all whatever those ingredients are. If you want chicken nuggets, then don't buy the frozen ones. Don't keep them in the house. You have to extend that gap as much as possible. So you You have to buy the chicken breast, you have to batter it, you have to make that egg wash, you have to pop it into the oven, and you have to wait for it. If you want those chicken nuggets, you'll have to earn it. If you want the cookies, you'll have to earn it. And also one of the benefits of this is you're having it much healthier. You're learning how to cook, you're learning how to earn your rewards, you're learning how to make healthy eating patterns, and you're learning how to focus much more on the food. You know how we talked about being more mindful around food? If you're cooking the food, then the reward is going to be much more, because you're going to be like, oh, these cakes are so delicious, oh, these cookies are so delicious. You get a massive reward, you get a massive high, a massive kick out of eating the things that you're quite proud of. So it's important to not restrict, because of the forbidden fruit theory. We'll want more of what we crave, but you'll have to just make it if you want it. Have whenever you want, but remember, you'll have to make it yourself. The only things you can keep in your house are healthy versions of foods, like banana chips, or mangoes, bananas, apples, fruits, all those kinds of things. Next, with ADHD, we'll have to learn how to control our emotions, because people with ADHD, they often have this thing called alexithymia, which is emotional blindness, really, because they can't really recognize their emotions. People might ask, Jonathan, what emotion are you feeling? Well, I'm feeling quite stressed. That's not an emotion. Oh, I'm feeling quite tired. No, that's not an emotion. We often have those responses for people who really struggle with alexithymia. And oftentimes, people with ADHD, they often dissociate themselves. That feeling where you feel like you're being possessed or you don't really recognize what's going on. So that happens very often during binge eating episodes. You eat the food and then it feels like all of a blur. Like, oh, where am I? It's been 15 minutes. I'm in my bed. There's lots of food all over me. There's tons of food in front of me. What happened? You feel like you just came out of a possession. So you tend to be dissociated from food when you have a binge eating episode. That's one of the key factors of binge eating as well as ADHD. That's the opposite of mindful eating. It's mindless eating, feeling dissociated from food. So what can we do? So this is the part where I highly recommend that you start tracking your emotions, tracking how you feel, because journaling, for example, I highly recommend, is really helpful on reducing this dissociation episodes and regulating what emotions you're feeling. Because sometimes all you need to do is just recognize what emotion are you feeling, and then that's already enough to crave that emotional satisfaction for, instead of food, you already found what emotion you're feeling, so don't need to do anything. If I'm feeling humiliated because of this emotion I'm feeling, then it's gonna prompt an action instead of just feeling stressed. What does that mean? Don't know what I'm gonna do, so I'm just gonna binge eat. And hopefully it goes away. So with journaling and constantly checking in on what emotions you're feeling, that can help you win the war before the battle even starts. If you want to learn how to overcome your emotional eating triggers, then check the link in the description of this video, because I have a free emotional eating quiz. It's a whole free 2-minute quiz that helps you recognize the main or the root trigger of why you're emotionally eating, and I'll provide a tailored solution for you. This also works for people who are neurotypical and people who have ADHD. So check that link out for that free quiz. And now, moving on to the next bit. So now let's get to the meaty bit about talking about food and insulin. So insulin is an important hormone for you to understand. So insulin, what does insulin do? So insulin is a hormone that tells your body, okay, there's food in our blood, then let's transfer that sugar that's in our blood into our cells. So that gives us the energy, and when insulin's released, it signals fullness. It tells our body, okay, the nutrients have been acquired, now let's feel full. But the interesting thing is, when you have a high level of fat cells or adipocytes, you might have this thing called insulin resistance. So our body has to pump in much more insulin for us to receive that sugar. So aka, long story short, your body has to eat more and more cookies to feel full. So we have increased cravings, we have a reduced reward response, and you might have insulin resistance. So how can you combat all of these? So to improve your insulin sensitivity, which is a good thing, the opposite of insulin resistance, exercise is very helpful to improve your insulin resistance. And exercise can also help contribute to reducing your weight, reducing those fat stores, and your body becomes much more efficient with accepting insulin, accepting energy, which will help reduce insulin resistance. So next is to make sure our meals contain lots of fiber. So fiber is found in vegetables, fruits, brown versions of carbs like brown rice, brown pasta, brown bread, all those kinds of things. Because fiber, it contains lots of volume, it takes up lots of room in our stomach. So when our stomach feels stretched, there are mechanical receptors, there are nerves in our stomach that signals to our body, okay, our stomach's feeling stretched. Let's increase leptin, which is the fullness hormone. Let's feel full. Because you can't rely on eating food to make you feel full. So you have to rely on the stretch of your stomach to help you feel full. And what you can do is to increase the fiber, increase your fruit and veg. So what I highly recommend is to make sure your whole plate contains half the plate of veggies, and then the rest is protein, fats and carbs. So try to focus half of your plate of veggies, and then the rest is protein, fats, and carbs. And on top of all of those, increasing your fruit and veg intake, keeping that stretch as much as possible during those meals, those gastric stretch, then you're also reducing your levels of inflammation because naturally you're eating anti-inflammatory foods. Veggies, blueberries, try to eat those, bananas, all of these things will actually increase your BDNF, which is the brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which will actually reduce your ADHD symptoms because you're increasing the signaling of your nerves to your brain. So you can see how all of this comes together, and this is quite a long video, but it's important to go back into this. If you're struggling with ADHD really intensely, then first of all, recognize what are the things that are contributing to those cravings, all of those 5 factors I talked about, and then you'll have a clear goal on how to understand what you can do to overcome ADHD related binge eating and obesity. And if you're struggling with binge eating, then check my one-to-one, because I'm happy to help people who are struggling with ADHD and their cravings at a one-to-one pace. And you can also check my online course in the link in the description. All my free resources, they're all appropriate for people with ADHD and also who are neurotypical, who struggle with binge eating. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you really enjoyed this video, you'd really like this one over here. So I'll see you next time, friends. See ya!